Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and once again, welcome to Dirk and Swap conversation on open source with our regular guest Dirk Hohndel, Chief Open Source Officer and VP at VMware. Dirk, it's nice to have you back on the show.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here. Good to see you.
Today, what I want to talk about is when we look at today's world, almost everybody is using open source. Some companies don't even realize that they use. I do a lot of interviews and I ask them, no, we don't have an open source story. Okay, so what technology do you use? And then they will start naming all those things. We use this, we use this, we use this. And then I'll ask, do you contribute? Yeah, we do. So they don't even know their own open source stories, which is fine because that is the idea. Is not open source is not a marketing thing to sell it. Some companies use it, some companies don't. They just they just want to use and move on. So what I want to understand or talk about today is that as companies are increasing usage of open source, and I am using the word user versus consumer because you are particular about that. So as companies they're also engaging with a lot of open source communities. And as we talked previously that the structured approach versus organic approach. So as these companies increase their engagement with open source communities and projects, what role does the structure play? Like, for example, VMware has an open source office, if I'm not wrong, something like that. Different companies have different terms. So I want to understand the importance of this approach, and should companies look at open source as something much more structured versus, our developers are contributing, only thing we worry about is licenses and CLAs, that's it.
So I think open source is everywhere, and it's surprising how many times still we talk to people who don't seem to have internalized that, because there is practically no software out there that doesn't have open source components included. Sometimes it's just small pieces, but generally whatever you do, whatever you touch, open source is part of it. And as such, if you are a company that is built around software, then open source is really something you need to pay attention to. Now, notice the way I phrased that, because companies that being built around software today is a surprisingly large subset of the industry. There are very, very few companies that don't create some of their values through software, through an online engagement, through a set of applications that they make available or that they use internally. And while 20 years ago, the ratio of companies that considered software critical for the business was not very big outside of high tech. Today, literally all companies in some way, shape, or form have an online and an app-driven, a software-driven experience. And COVID has made that worse because no restaurant can survive without takeout, which means they have to have a way to have a web presence and to allow online ordering. And it has reached pretty much all segments of the industry. And so to me, it's really important that people who consider software a core part of their value proposition also have a strategy around software and a structure how they engage with software. Now that we've said that and we combine those two pieces, almost all software contains open source. Most companies should have a strategy, a structure around how they deal with software. You put these two pieces together and you get to a fairly simple conclusion that says companies really should have a structured and strategic approach to open source. And that normally means you should have some form of an open source program office. Of course, I'm biased because I run VMware's open source program office. But I think if you look at the role that software plays and the role that open source software plays for most everyone in this place, you should have a strategy there. You should have people whose job it is to take care of that.
Setting up an office also means you're making heavy investment. And these days, a lot of companies are also looking at cutting costs. So should they look at this open source program office as a cost center? Or just before we go there, since you are leading this effort at VMware, how at VMware, what is open source program office? Just tell me, what does it all do?
So different companies have very different approaches to how they organize open source program office, where in the company it's organizationally located, and what the scope is. So for a company that is actively engaged in open source, that is creating software packages for internal or external use, that is contributing to open source projects, you have to have a compliance function. You have to make sure that you comply with the licenses, that you create an open source license text for your applications, that you make sources available where required, and that you have a way in which you regulate your own contributions to open source projects. So that compliance function is very typically one of the core roles of an open source program office. But in a lot of companies, including VMware, we have quite a few additional functions in an open source program office. We have a team that is focused on our role in open source communities. How do we engage? What is our strategic goal? How are we setting our goals? How are we monitoring our progress? How are we making sure that we're interacting with these communities in a productive manner? We have similarly teams that look at our engineering engagement with open source projects. Same idea, how can we help these projects? How can we focus on community health instead of just self-serving activities? So those two functions, a community strategy, a technical engagement strategy, are often hosted in an open source program office. And then, especially if you are in the software industry, if you are in the larger computer industry, very often you have a strategic function here. So you have a topic that is focused around how do we want to use open source in our products? How do we engage? Where are the projects that are critical to us? Where do we need to pay attention? It's part of the M&A activities. I mean, VMware just acquired SaltStack, which is a largely open source based company. So there is a significant investment in the overall corporate strategy that comes from an open source program office.
I mean, this may be a little bit controversial, but I also remember a couple of years ago, a lot of companies were facing a lot of, I don't want to name any companies where they ended up, violating some, or they ended up releasing a code that was not supposed to go in public and open source. Then they had to release the whole stack because of that. But now we don't hear about that because most companies, they do have open source program offices. Those problems have been resolved. So does that also help companies with also dealing with the legal aspect of open source? Because it's not just about how you're collaborating or communicating with the open source community, but also to kind of protect your own IP. I don't like to use the word IP in the terms of Linux and free software, especially Richard Stallman won't like it, but that is the reality.
Of course. And what I said about earlier in the context of compliance, that to me really is one of those key compliance functions, that you have an understanding how are your people releasing software in the broadest meaning of that word, whether it's binary releases and the compliance of those with the licenses, or whether it's source releases and the understanding of what am I releasing? What rights am I granting? Is there a patent grant involved? Do I have patents in this place? Is this actually software source code that I wanted to release? So having a robust process that helps your engineers in that and that sets clear policies and how do we interact on sites like GitHub or GitLab or any of the other source sharing sites? What is our process for approvals to be allowed and to be able to actually create repositories, create projects? What is the link with your marketing team? How do you prevent that your naming of open source projects causes conflicts with your product naming? There are so many angles around this process of engaging with open source that need an internal leadership function. And you talk about the past examples of escapes where software was suddenly available in the open that wasn't supposed to be available. And one of the consequences of that has been that over the last few years, we have seen a shift up in the hierarchy where open source program offices were established. Early on, you would see a lot of companies try to create an open source program office function staffed with part-time junior program manager somewhere in the marketing team. And that often has not led to the desired results. Now, VMware went kind of the other extreme. I'm an executive, I'm a vice president, I report directly to the CTO of the company. So we certainly have an executive function around that. I have technically a C-level title. And that is certainly not very common in the industry. But a lot more companies have that as a director level function that is reporting directly into an exec and that has a lot more breadth and reach across the company and is much more tied into all of the processes that the company uses from the IT side, from the legal side, from the marketing side to ensure that the engagement with these communities is productive. But so far, we have mostly talked about companies that actively engage, that have a software mindset. One of the things that I really thought we should consider today is all the companies to whom software and open source is much more a byproduct, much more an indirect part of what they do, where very often this whole idea of engagement with the community is odd and unusual and new. And those really are the companies that I think need the open source program office the most. Those companies really need to create a solid understanding of the dependencies on open source, their engagement with open source, and frankly, their strategy, their goals, their plans around that. And creating such an open source program office is almost a forcing function to have those hard conversations. And for that alone, I recommend that any reasonably sized company considers creating a small open source program office to get started in their analysis of where they are and where they want to be.
Right. I think that is actually even more important, as you mentioned, because big tech companies, they already understand how things work. Is those companies who, as you rightly said, software is not their primary product or whatever. At the same time, I am also curious that does it have to be a company of a specific size, or is it because the basic idea is that it doesn't really matter how big or small you are. If you are touching open source, you are touching all those things and it's going to affect, it doesn't matter in what is your size of the company or what is revenue. So it's more or less like it should, if your company is touching, and actually the fact is, I don't think there's any company who is not using open source today. If your company is consuming or using open source in any capacity, you should have a kind of structured approach towards how to engage with the open source community. That is the right way of doing things. But still, do you think that, okay, this is the size that, hey, you are just a startup, but the beauty with the startups is that they, the CTO, the CEOs, they themselves are neck deep, so they do know. But how critical should it be the part of their strategy?
So this is a wonderful conversation about the question, how do companies grow and how do tiny, small, medium, large, ginormous companies do the same things just very differently? If you have a tiny company, if you have a under 10 person company, very typically you have few formal processes, you have a very limited concept of an office for anything, because you all just catch everything that needs to get done, and it's typically somewhat chaotic and mostly driven by the energy of the people involved. And so to me, telling people, oh, you need to create this office is kind of silly. If you look at this growth trajectory, there is a very significant change in how companies typically work, somewhere around the 20-ish people size, when suddenly you need a hierarchy, you need to have an HR function, you need a serious legal advice, you need to have a better budgeting finance process. And then there is a second similar inflection point somewhere in the couple hundred, maybe 100, maybe 200, maybe 400 people, somewhere there, where suddenly it becomes far more structured and processes start to become super important. And that really is the point. If you reach that size, you should have an open source program office as one of the key functions that you drive that you manage against, that you use to help you define your strategy, your direction, your plans, your actions.
Awesome. We talked about why you should have it. Let's talk about how to help them build, because first of all, there is a kind of shortage of people who I mean, there are people who understand open source. Not every company is as lucky as VMware to have somebody to head the department who has been in open source. But as you were saying earlier, that sometimes it used to be some middle manager or some developer who was heading this office. This is an office that has a lot of responsibilities and burden as well. It's not something you're not just looking at those things. So how can they embrace this practice principle? And if there is already also, it should not become a cost center for that. So you did talk about the benefit that it brings to the company itself, but still, how they can set up an open source program office with the limited resources they may have, and also something that contributes back to the growth of the company.
Yeah. So let's look at the cost for a second. To me, this open source program office is part of the structured cost that goes into your risk management and into your overall strategy setting for your company. So it's part of this very executive function. And oh, by the way, this is why at times you see open source program offices located in the legal department, which has its challenges because legal departments are extremely risk averse. So you often get very restrictive policies as a response to that. But that is very typical where the impetus for all this comes from. So from a cost perspective, how do you look at it? It's an executive cost of driving your strategy and reducing your risk. Now, how do you do this? I will, as always, say full disclosure. I'm on the board of the Linux Foundation. I have been involved in the Linux Foundation for the entirety of its existence. But the Linux Foundation actually has the to-do group, which has done a tremendous job in creating a ton of publicly available documentation of how to set up an open source program office, what policies could look like, what processes could look like, what are some of the pitfalls of what you need to make sure you don't do wrong, where are user groups, where are open source groups, open source program office groups getting together, exchanging best practices. Where can I ask a question? So there are forums available. There's a ton of documentation available to make it really easy for a company of any size to get started and not to have to reinvent the wheel from scratch and to redo all the mistakes that everyone else has already done, and instead to benefit from the learnings of this industry over the last decade or so. So to me, that would be the first resource I go to, look at what the to-do group has published and start from there and pick and choose what you think makes sense given your size, your industry, your direction, your goals.
Dirk, we talked about why companies should have all the benefits of having it, and earlier also, as we were talking about, a lot of companies, they mistakenly release their IPs into open source, which were not supposed to be, and then some companies they violated some licenses, all those things. So what I want to talk about is that what are the risks of not having an office like that versus some benefits of okay, yeah, we don't have it, we don't care, but do those risks outweigh that, hey, the cost that you're saving there?
Yeah, I think they very much do, because a lot of people look at this and say, oh, open source is not important to us, or we are so small, who cares? But there are some really tangible risks in there. And it's very easy to end up in a situation where you violate some licenses and you end up shipping software that you actually don't have license to ship, which can have massive repercussions for what you do, even if you aren't a software company, even if it's just the app that enables your business. And if suddenly somebody sends you a cease and desist that you can't use that app anymore, that can hit to the core of what you do as a business. Similarly, if you have dependencies on projects that you don't understand and you don't realize that are unmaintained, or you are on an orphan branch, and suddenly you have security implications of the software that you use that you weren't aware of, and there is an exploit out in the wild, and you have to overnight re-architect your software. You have to have a significant investment in redoing what you thought was already done. So from a risk perspective, doing the minimum amount of work that it takes to understand your exposure to open source software and to make sure that you do this reasonably well has a massive reduction of risk as a result. And risk is something that every company has to be very, very careful of, because you don't want to end up in a situation where one mistake costs you the foundation on which you build your business and has an avalanche of consequences afterwards. So to me, whenever people ask me, well, should I really do this? I always say, you should get started. You should do the analysis. You should go through the initial questionnaires of how do you deal with compliance? How do you do with contributions? And simply get to the point where you understand what you do. And almost everyone who does that immediately goes to, and then you have a small, appropriately sized function that continues to track this and that makes sure that you continue to stay on the good side of all that.
It's more or less like having an airbag if you're driving a car. It's important. Also, when it comes to those violations that you mentioned, it's not happens that often. Big companies don't go after. They are patent trolls or all those trolls. They go after companies. Second is that if you're also looking at acquisition and mergers, the company who's going to acquire you will look into the kind of risk they are taking. Third is that, okay, right now you're small, but you will, if you're an ambitious company, you will grow big at some point, and then the kind of technical debt you will carry with you will be, so it's not worth not doing it. It should be critical. If you're building a company which is using software in any capacity, especially open source, it should be part of it. It should be like an airbag.
I think you're highlighting some of these key omissions in people's plans. It really is about thinking ahead and understanding what are the consequences of not doing it now and what are the costs of trying to do it later. So I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Dirk, once again, thank you for talking about this topic. And it's since you are heading a department there, so it's also coming a lot from inside, and I can look it from outside that how it does make sense. So I really love this conversation, and as usual, we'll see each other again in the next week or so to talk about another interesting topic.
Thanks, Swap. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope we helped some people make some good decisions.